Welcome to this Untitled Excel VBA tutorial. In this video we're going to have a look at how to query a web page using VBA query tables. So the video is all about how to get data from a web page into Excel. We'll start with a bit of background information and show you how to use Excel's built-in web query tool. Basically that's to show you how horrifically basic the tool is and why you might want to consider using VBA instead of that tool. So we'll show you then how to create a basic query table using VBA, connecting to a fairly static basic website. It's part of the WiseOwl website actually. Then we'll look at how you can set up refresh options so you can make sure that the data table refreshes either on a regular basis or when you open up the file. And then we'll talk about the various different elements you can import into a query table. So you can choose either to import an entire web page, all the tables on the page, or just specific tables on the page. To help out with that little part, we're going to teach you a tiny little bit of how to read basic HTML. So we're going to look at how to find table tags in the HTML of a web page and also how you can see the HTML of a web page, just in case you don't know how to do that. The latter half of the video then is going to create a slightly more dynamic example using something called URL query strings. So we're going to get the user to pass in different values into the URL to connect to a web page to affect the results returned by it. It's quite a nice sort of dynamic example using a set of currency exchange rates and the ability to choose which currency you use and what amount you're trying to convert. So it's quite a fun video, this one. Let's get started. Before we get started on the VBA side of generating query tables, we're going to have a look at a quick simple tool built into Excel that allows you to generate a query table without writing even a single line of code. So if nothing else, this will give you a bit of a background and insight into what the code we're about to write is going to try to do. So we're going to use a tool that's on the Data tab of the ribbon. Now I'm using Excel 2013 in this video. It's a brand new completely blank workbook. The same tool exists by the way in Excel 2016 and 2010 and I'm pretty sure 2007 as well. So whichever version of Excel you're using from 2007 onwards, you should have access on the Data tab to a button that says From Web. So what this little tool does is it launches a very basic web browser. And when I say basic, I really do mean basic. I mean it's even worse than Internet Explorer. But what you can do here is attempt to browse to a web page to identify a table that you want to import into a new Excel worksheet. Now the key to using this tool effectively is finding a good candidate website that has lots of different tables you could choose to import. Now you could technically, if you really wanted to torture yourself, use this tool as a basic web browser. So I've got Google up, I could legitimately do a Google search. Let's maybe search for the WiseOwl page. Let's search for WiseOwl training. Sorry, WiseOwl, I'll spell it properly. WiseOwl training. And you'll see in there that you get a basic web browser and I can click on the WiseOwl link and it will browse me to WiseOwl training. Now although things have worked pretty smoothly so far, that's more to do with the fact that the WiseOwl website isn't actually all that sophisticated, although Andy Brown, the guy who wrote the website, won't thank me for saying that, so hopefully he won't watch this video. But this web browser struggles with many modern websites, things with lots of dynamic elements, HTML5, JavaScript, etc. It tends to fall over quite easily. So rather than trying to use this basic browser to find the site you're interested in, what I'd suggest doing is first of all cancelling out of that or closing it down and then just using a regular web browser like for instance Google Chrome, which I have open here, or Firefox, or even Internet Explorer or Edge, or whichever other one you want to use. So I've got a couple of web pages open already that I've browsed to. So I've got another page on the WiseOwl website which is a list of our courses, so just a few basic tables in here, and again this is a good candidate for a web query because it's got some nicely organised separate tables of data. Probably a slightly more real-world use for this web query tool would be importing something like currency exchange tables. So rather than a basic sort of fairly static set of list of courses like these tables are, something that dynamically changes on a regular basis like exchange rates. So these are good because these have got lots of different tables available that we can import. So if you wanted to use the same sites that I'm using, then feel free to just copy the URL. Of course you can pause the video and type that in. What I will do just to start with is copy the WiseOwl URL. So for the WiseOwl course, I'm going to copy that one first of all, and then I'm going to head back to Excel and I'm going to launch my little web tool again. So from the Data tab in the ribbon, choose From Web. From here then I can simply paste in the URL in the address bar and then I can click the Go button to browse directly to that website, so I don't have to navigate through lots of different pages that might make this tool fall over. Now the reason, as I say, I chose this particular page was because it was full of different tables. And what I'm looking for now is, at the top left hand corner of any table, I'm looking for one of these little yellow boxes with a black arrow. That indicates a separate region of data that this tool can import. However, if I scroll down to find the individual tables on this page, sadly the tools failed to detect them. What I should be seeing are little yellow boxes at the top left hand corner. Now again, this is kind of a bit of a feature of modern websites. More old-fashioned websites, when back in the day when essentially sites were made up of a bunch of HTML table tags, and you had tables and tables within tables and so on and so on and so on. Each individual one of these tables would have a separate box that I could choose to import. Currently, sadly, all I've got in this page is essentially a single box that I could use to import the entire page. So I'm just going to do that very quickly just to show you how that works. I'm going to select that box, it goes green with a tick in it, and if I click the import button, I'll get a separate dialog box popping up asking me where I want to import the data to. I'm just going to put this on a new worksheet for the time being. There's a bunch of extra properties that we're going to investigate when we get to the VBA side, and at that point I'm just going to click OK. So I'll get a brand new worksheet, and it's going to try and query the Wise Owl courses page. And because I've just imported the entire page, really all I get is a great big long massive list of individual cell values, which isn't particularly useful. You can kind of identify the individual tables part way through the page. So that's not particularly useful. I'm going to just delete that worksheet and go back to sheet 1. Choose yes, I do want to delete that, and I'll show you how the same technique works for the other web page that I browsed to. So again, just going back to my generic web browser, I'm going to head to my currency exchange tables website, and again just copy the URL from the address bar. Once I've done that, I can head back into Excel and again choose my From Web tool and then just paste in the URL. Now this is an example of one of those sites that's got lots of dynamic content in it, which this basic web browser really doesn't like. As you're about to see, if I hit the go button, I'm going to get presented with eventually a whole bunch of different little error boxes popping up as it loads the page. It seems to be reasonably happy at this point. Well, you often get really horrible little error messages. Essentially, if you get little error messages popping up, then all you need to do is click the no button. It'll ask you things like, do you want to try to debug the web page? You definitely don't. Just keep on clicking no until you run out of error messages and it actually takes you to the page. So you can hopefully see in this example, although I have got a single yellow box at the top left hand corner that would let me select the entire page, what I've also got are individual tables with little yellow box at the top. So hovering over the little yellow box gives you an indication of what table of data it's going to import. So I'm going to check the box next to this table. You can choose more than one at the same time, so I might want to choose this one down here as well, so I could choose to import more than one table at the same time. I think that's probably enough just for the sake of demonstration. And then at that point, if I click import again, I'm going to choose to put it on a new worksheet. Just really briefly, the properties give you access to do things like choose whether the table will enable background refresh, whether it refreshes on a regular basis, whether it refreshes when you open the file. Again, we'll have a look at all of these properties when we look at the VBA code. You can also give it a more sensible name than the one that it's been sort of automatically generates. I'm just going to click OK at this point and then click OK again to create a new worksheet with those two tables of data, and this should look a little bit more useful. So that it's much more easy to see hopefully here that you've got two separate tables imported, much better organized. Again, I'm just going to delete that worksheet. The whole point of this video is to show you how to do the same thing using VBA. And one of the advantages of using VBA is that the VBA technique is much cleverer at identifying the different tables in a page, even for the Wise Owl courses list, where the basic query tool couldn't see the individual tables. We can actually do that using VBA. Okay, so from here let's head into the VB editor. I'm going to head to the Developer tab and choose Visual Basic, and as ever we'll need to insert a brand new module, so let's right click and choose Insert Module, which I'm not going to bother renaming. I'm just going to create a quick subroutine which is going to be called Sub Import Wise Owl Courses. So that's the first example we're going to do. We're going to use a few basic variables for this, so I'm going to start with a simple worksheet variable, which I'm going to say dim ws as worksheet. The really important one here is one called Qt, or which I'm going to call Qt, as a query table. So a query table is a type of object that we're generating using the basic query tool. I'm also going to have a simple string variable which is going to hold the URL of our web page, so the site that we're importing data from. So I'm going to say dim URL as string, and then the first thing I'm going to do is set the URL's value. So I'm going to say URL equals, and I'm just going to make this equal to the URL of the YSL courses page. So I'm going to quickly switch back to that website, copy the URL, head back to the VB editor, and then paste it in inside the double quotes. Next, we're going to create a new worksheet, and the reason I'm doing that is because every individual worksheet maintains its own separate collection of query tables. So just to keep things sort of separated out in this video, I'm going to have a separate worksheet for each query table that we generate. So I'm going to say set ws equals worksheets.add, and that's a fairly standard technique we've used many times in the course of this video series. And then what I'm going to do is add a query table to that worksheet. So to do that, I'm going to say set qt equals ws.querytables.add. I'm going to open up some parentheses at that point, and there's a couple of compulsory parameters we need to fill in, which are connection and destination. So the connection is the most important thing here. If I type in a space underscore just so I can write this instruction across multiple different lines, I'm going to say connection equals, so I'll use named parameters, and then for a URL parameter it's got to be preceded with URL semicolon. So instead of double quotes, URL semicolon, followed by an ampersand, and then the actual URL that we've stored in this URL variable. So here I can just say URL. Then I'm going to type a comma and a space underscore, and then the destination, we just need to state the top left hand corner, so where the data will start being pasted from essentially. So I'm going to set destination equals range A1. So it's going to start pasting it at the top left hand corner of the worksheet. Close a couple of sets of parentheses there, and then we're essentially ready to execute the query. To execute the query, all you really need to do is apply the refresh method to it. So if I say qt.refresh, and then that's basically all of the code written, I'm just going to restore down the VB editor window at that point, and hopefully we can see Excel in the background. And there we go. And if I just briefly use the F8 key to step through, so you can see the URL being set, obviously that happens, and then a new worksheet gets created, and then we create a new query table. So it's not this instruction that actually makes the query table appear, that just generates the object. To actually make it appear in Excel, we need to apply the refresh method. So if I hit the F8 key, you ought to see this little query running in the background, and make sure I hit F8 to end the sub, and you can see that reasonably intelligently actually, the query in this case has picked out all of the individual tables from the YSL courses page rather than the entire page, which is what we got when we used the basic data from web tool. Now I'm just going to delete this worksheet and go back to the VB editor because there are lots of other things that we can do to modify the way the query table works. So back in the VB editor, rather than just refreshing the query table, we're going to apply a bunch of different properties to it. So I'm actually going to write a separate statement. I'm going to write a with statement because we're going to have so many different properties we're going to change. So we're going to say with qt, and the very last thing we're going to do is refresh it, and let's have an end with there. So before we refresh the query table, there's a bunch of other properties we'd like to set. There are a couple of properties associated with refreshing your query table. So obviously we can apply the refresh method whenever we want to explicitly refresh the table, but you can also set it up to refresh automatically. So for instance, there's one way you can set the query table to refresh automatically whenever you open the file. So the property for that is called refresh on file open, and you can simply set that to true if you want to refresh the query table each time you open the file. We also saw on the dialog box earlier on that you could set the query table to refresh after so many minutes, and to do that you could set the refresh period property. So refresh period equals. Now for this property you can set a number with a range of 0 to 32,767, and that value represents the number of minutes between each refresh. So for instance, if I set it to 5, it would be 5 minutes between each refresh of the table. If you'd set that up previously and you wanted to disable the automatic refresh, you could simply set this value to 0 and that will disable it. So in this example I'm not actually going to bother having an automatic refresh. I'll have a refresh on file open, but I'm certainly not intending to wait around for at least a minute just so that you can see the table will automatically refresh. It might be worthwhile keeping that in there for reference for later on. Feel free to just comment it out. I'm just going to remove that line altogether. You can also change the query table's name using the name property. So we saw earlier on the dialog box that query tables are given a default name, which is usually based on the range of data being imported, but those names aren't particularly useful or readable. So you can assign a unique, specific or explicit name to your tables, which will help you to identify it. So if you ever need to refer to your query table in code later on, you can reference it, of course, as virtually every object in any Excel VBA collection. You can reference it by an index number, but a query table you might want to reference it by name instead. So in this case I'm going to call this query table wall courses, wall short for wise owl. So there we go, there's the name for the table. The final property that will change just before we see the effect of all this code is the property that changes the formatting of the web data. So there is a property called web formatting. So I say web formatting and then make that equal to, I've got a variety of options here. So I can set all, none, or RTF. So the default option here is actually web formatting all. So the default format you saw earlier on tried to bring in all of the formatting from the web page. I didn't think that was particularly successful or attractive personally, but maybe that's just me. You could set this to none, which means you just get plain text, which is what we saw when we imported the data using the basic query tool from the Excel data tab. I've found most success using rich text formatting, RTF, so that's the technique I'm going to use here. Feel free to play around with these just so you can see the various different options. So having done all that, I'm not going to bother stepping through this code this time. I'm just going to hit the F5 key or click the green triangle button to play or run the subroutine, and this time we should see a slightly different appearance to the data that we import. One other thing quickly worthwhile mentioning about this is that the web formatting can change the way hyperlinks work. So with rich text formatting you can see that this is just raw text basically. I don't have any hyperlinks in here at all. If I switch back and I change my web formatting to Excel web formatting all, which was actually the default, if I execute this again, although I personally don't think the look of the text is particularly nice, you do actually get the links to the URLs that those hyperlinks point to. So it's a bit of a balancing act, I suppose. It depends on what's more important to you, the raw data or the links and the functionality. I'm just going to delete that page at that point and go back to the rich text formatting. I prefer the look of that one, so I'm just going to change that one back to RTF. So far we've just accepted that whenever we run this tool we get whatever data the query table thinks is appropriate to return. So in this case it's returned all 3 tables from that Wise Owl Courses page. But you've got a little bit more control over this than you might expect as well. So there's another property that determines what data you actually import from the web query. So if you say or look for the web selection type property, you can set this to one of 3 different things, either all tables, the entire page, or more intriguingly, specified tables. So at this point we've got all tables from that web page. So the way this works is basically it looks for HTML table tags. So if I just set this to all tables and run the code again, we're going to see exactly the same result. So that's clearly the default. So what this does is I try to identify table tags. Now if you know a little bit about HTML this will make a bit more sense. And if you don't know a bit about HTML you can still understand a little bit about it. If I take you back to the web browser and have a look at the Wise Owl Courses page, and I have a right click in the background of this page. This works in any web browser by the way, it's not unique to Google Chrome. You can do this for any web page in any browser. Right click and view page source. What that will do is it will open up, in Google Chrome's case it opens up another tab in the same browser showing you the HTML code sitting behind this web page, which is kind of interesting to see. It's quite a nice way to find out how web pages are built. So if you scroll down a little bit, basically, just in case you don't know anything about HTML, certainly not trying to patronize you if you do know HTML reasonably well, but HTML pages are essentially built of different tags. So you can see these tags are indicated with the open angle bracket there, and this is called a div tag, a division tag. What I'm really looking for in here is something called a table tag. So here I've found a table tag, so that's the open table tag. Now if your web developer has written the HTML cleanly, they'll have written beautifully indented code to make it easy to identify the corresponding closing table tag. So closing tags start with a /. So we've got the open table tag there, and everything between those 2 tags defines one single table. So that's what that property that we were just looking at was trying to identify. So it's got one table tag there, then there should be another table tag a little bit further down, there's another one, and its corresponding closes there, then a little bit further down again, there's another open table tag, and that should be the last one in this page. If we found any more table tags, then they should have been imported as well, but if I kept on scrolling down and down and down, there are only 3 table tags in that document. So that hopefully helps you to explain, or helps to explain to you why, when you say Excel all tables, that's the set of data that you get. So as we saw, that was the default selection type for the web query. If we change this from Excel all tables, let's go back, and I'm just going to hit Control and Space to redisplay the IntelliSense list. Let's try the Excel entire page. Now this should be more like what we got when we used the basic web browser tool as part of the data tab of the ribbon. So if I run this one this time, what I should get is a bit more information. So you can clearly see now we've got all of the other links that were imported at the top of the page. And sorry, if I just scroll down the page a little bit, you should see the tables do appear. Rich text formatting means we get a bit more of an interesting output, but you can see the tables appear as well, but it sits alongside all of the other items that are in that page. Now the final setting for this property, rather than entire page or all tables, is one called Excel specified tables, which is kind of interesting. As long as you know how many tables there are, then you can specify exactly which tables to bring back by combining this property with a property called web tables. So you can set the web tables property equal to a comma separated list of numbers corresponding to which tables you want to return. So for instance, if I just wanted to return, let's say, the 3rd table from my YSL courses, that's the one full of all these really nerdy, geeky programming courses, which are quite good fun. So let's say web tables equals 3. Now if it's just one single table you want, you can enter this as a number. Strictly speaking, the web tables property is a string property, but you can enter a number and it will be implicitly converted into a string. Technically speaking, it should be entered as a string in double quotes. And if you wanted to return more than one table, you'd have to write a comma separated list, and that would have to be written inside a set of double quotes. So in this case, I'm just going to return table number 3 just to prove that that one works. I'm just going to hit the execute button or the run button, and we'll see that we do indeed get just one single table this time. If I change this and let's say I want tables 1 and 2, I can type in 1, 2 and then hit F5 again to run this one again, and this time I'll just get tables 1 and 2. So that's kind of a cool technique to use to control exactly which data you get back from a big web page. So that's all well and good. You can choose exactly which tables you want to appear on each page. But what if you wanted to simply create a separate web page for every individual table on the web page? Let's just tidy up our workbook a little bit first. I'm going to head back to Excel and I'm going to select the last sheet that I just created, which is sheet 16 in my case, and then hold down the Shift key and click on, which in my case is sheet 5. So I'm just going to leave the blank sheet 1 there. And I can just right click on any of the sheets I've selected and choose delete. Choose that I definitely want to do that, and that leaves me with just our blank sheet 1. What I'm then going to do is head back to the VBA editor, and I'll just maximize the window this time, because what I'm going to do next is just make a copy paste of this subroutine. So I'm going to copy the entire thing and paste it in immediately below. I'm just going to modify the name of the subroutine so that we don't have 2 routines with the same name in the same scope. I'll call this import YSL courses with loop. And the idea behind this one is going to be that I'm going to import all the YSL course tables, but I'm going to have one on a separate sheet. Now ordinarily in VBA, when you want to process a set of items in a collection, you'd use a for each loop. But sadly the query tables object doesn't expose the web tables as a collection, it's just a comma separated list of values. So a more appropriate loop to use in this case is a for next loop. And for a for next loop you need to have some kind of counter variable. So what I'm going to do is declare a variable called I as integer, and then a little bit further down, once I've set the URL, so I'm always going to get my data from the same web page, the same courses page from the YSL website. Before I start creating new worksheets, I'm going to begin my for next loops. I'm going to say for I equals, and in this case I'm going to set the range that the loop will work over to the number of tables on that page. So I know that it starts at 1 and it goes up to 3. So I can say for I equals 1 to 3. At that point I'm just going to select and indent all the remaining lines below, and then after that, just before end sub, I'm going to say next I. So that forms the close of the loop at the point at which it will return to the top and then start processing these details again. So for each one of these numbers, 1, 2 and 3, we're going to create a new worksheet, create a new query table on that new sheet pointing to that page with the same destination each time, and then set up the properties of the query table. The really important thing we're going to do here is, rather than specifying an exact comma-separated list of table numbers, we're going to reference the value of our I variable. So appreciate that this is an integer, but it will be implicitly converted into a string so that it will query the correct item. So at that point, let's just restore down the VB editor window, and then we're just going to execute this by pressing the F5 key, and we should see that we end up with 3 new sheets. It might take a little while for each one of those to refresh, but we've got sheet 19 here, which has got the geeky nerdy courses on it, then sheet 18, and then sheet 17 as well, each one with a different query table showing me a different range of values. Okay, so we've dealt with an example where we've got a fairly static basic website like the YSL list of courses, which is great as long as you just want, I guess, a one-off import. If you've got something a bit more changeable, like for example our currency exchange site, then you need something that's a little bit more dynamic and flexible to handle that. So what we're going to do is develop a system that creates a single worksheet with a table of these top 10 conversion rates, but we're going to make this worksheet sort of queryable, so you'll have a couple of parameters that you can modify to change the table of data that you return. To get started, what I'm going to do is head back to the VB editor and the Excel workbook, and I'm going to, I'm going to head back up to the very first subroutine that we wrote. In fact, I'm going to maximize the VB editor window so I've got a bit more space. I'm going to copy the entire subroutine called import YSL courses. So I'm just going to copy that to the clipboard and then insert a new module. So to start with, I'm going to, if I paste that subroutine in and just modify its name, to start with what I want to be able to do is establish which table from my website I need to import. So I'm going to call this one import X rates. I'll try that again. And then we're going to modify this subroutine just to establish which table we're going to be working with. Okay, so first things first, I'll need to modify the URL, of course. So let's head back to the web browser and we can copy the URL from the address bar and then simply head back to the VB editor and paste that in place of the YSL URL. I'll add a new worksheet for the time being, and the connection is all set up fine. We'll stick it into cell A1 for the time being. What I'm then going to do is just modify the name of the table I'm going to create. I'm going to call this one X rates. The formatting doesn't really matter in this case. What I do want to do here is, rather than getting specified tables, I'm not sure because I haven't looked at the HTML of this page. I don't know how many tables there actually are on the page, or which ones I should import. So what I'm going to do, just to give myself a bit of a clue about how to modify this and make it more specific, I'm going to go back to Excel All Tables, and then I'm just going to temporarily comment out the Web Tables line. Having done that, what I'm going to do is I'm just restore down the VB editor window, make sure I can see Excel in the background, and then I can execute this subroutine just to see what I actually get. So I appear to have got a couple of different tables back from this particular query. So I've got one table here, and then there's a break, there's a blank line, and another table. If I just scroll down in the Excel window, so it looks like there are just 2 tables in that page. So I could choose to go with both, I could happily import them both, but what I think I'm going to do here is just limit myself to just one single table. So having established that there are indeed 2 separate tables, I'm going to go back to the VB editor and I'm going to modify this so that it's not Excel All Tables anymore. I'm going to use Excel Specified Tables, and then I'm going to uncomment the Web Tables property and make sure that I'm only getting table number 1. So again, just to give that one a quick test, if I execute that subroutine again, this time I only get one single table. Okay, now that I've established I'm getting the right results, well, I'm just going to do a little bit of tidying up in the worksheet. So I'm going to take away all of the extra worksheets apart from the original blank sheet 1. And if I delete all of those, I'm going to make a last little tweak to my import X-rate routine. I'm going to make sure that I put the data starting at cell A5. And having done all of that, I'm just going to run this one more time, and then I've got the basis of a simple queryable model. So next job is to create some way for the user to choose a currency. So rather than just getting US dollars all the time, we'll give them an option of different currencies and also an actual amount to convert. Now the reason we're going to be able to make this system is because of the way the URL works for this particular website. If I switch back to my web browser and just have a quick look at the URL for the xrates.com site, you can see that after the page that I'm browsing to, there's a question mark followed by a series of parameters. So this is referred to as a query string. So after the question mark, it indicates what parameters have been passed into this page to give me the right results. So you can see I've got a from parameter here that's currently set to USD, I guess US dollars of course, and then amount equals 1. So it's a reasonably good guess that there's not, not always this obvious, of course. Certain websites make these a little bit more obscure, but in this case it's fairly easy to guess what how these parameters work. We can modify them either by using the user interface that's been provided to us. If I choose GBP for British pounds, and that'll update the tables, and you'll see that the query string has changed as well. Another option there was euros. I could actually happily modify this manually in the URL. So I delete GBP and type in EUR for euros and then just hit enter, and we'll see this time that it changes to euros. I can also change the amount, and I can do that again quite happily either by typing into the user interface or just manually editing the query strings, let's say 199, and see what that gives us. So you can see all these values change the results of the web page. Now because this is essentially just a string, it means we've got the opportunity to build this URL out of various component parts. So let's head back to the workbook and let's create a couple of simple inputs for the user to select both a currency and an amount. Now I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time making this look attractive, so what I'm going to do, I'll just zoom in a little bit, and in cell A1 I'm going to type in a quick little title here that says currency, and then next door to that what I'd like to do is create a drop down list to restrict what values the user can select. We could use some fancy form control tools at this point, but what I'm going to do just for convenience is use the data validation tools in Excel. So if I head to the data tab in the ribbon and choose data validation, what I get then is a dialog box allowing me to specify or limit the values that can be entered into this cell. I'm going to choose from the drop down list the option called list, and there's a couple of ways I can populate my list. I could have a range of values typed into a worksheet somewhere, and I can use the range selector to select those cells. Alternatively, I can just type in a comma separated list into this box directly. So let's just do a couple of basic ones. We'll say USD followed by a comma, then GBP, comma, and EUR. And if there were any more that I wanted to use, I could work out what those values should be from the query string, just go back to the website and do a few tests, and at that point I'm just going to click OK, and I'll see that I get a little drop down list and I can select one of those three values. So I'm just going to choose GBP for the time being. We can use a similar sort of technique to allow the user to select an amount. So let's head into cell A2 and type in a quick title. We'll call that one amount. And then in cell B2, what I'd like to do is restrict the user to only entering some kind of number. So I'm going to select cell B2 and then head back to the data tab in the ribbon and choose data validation. Now this time I don't want to allow any value. I would like to allow a decimal number, and I can choose to assign a value between a minimum and a maximum, or I could have a variety of other comparison operators. I'm going to choose between, actually. Between seems like a sensible choice, and I'm going to have a minimum here of, let's say, 0.01, and then a maximum of, I don't know, let's say 100. I think that seems like a fairly reasonable, sensible range. It's possible to assign error messages. If you've dealt with data validation before, you'll be familiar with this little technique, but I'm just going to head to the error alert page and make sure that I'm stopped if I try to enter a value that isn't a decimal number between the range I've specified, and maybe add a quick little title here that says invalid value, and then, or invalid amount perhaps might be a bit of a better message. This is just to avoid seeing the generic "you entered an invalid value" message. You can say the amount must be a decimal value between, if I can spell properly, 0.1 and 100. So at that point if I click OK, what I'll now find is if I type in a decimal number between the range I've specified, everything's perfectly fine. If I try to type in text or anything that isn't a valid number, I'll get the message that I've typed in. So it's kind of like a convenient way to display a message box, but without having to write in any VBA code. Now, Data validation, if you know this, apologies for mentioning this already, but if you know about data validation, then you'll know there's one surefire, really easy way to override the validation. If I type in any random bit of text, I can happily just copy that cell and then paste it over the top of the validated cell, and that will essentially destroy any validation that I've added. I'm just going to undo that just to go back. So just bear in mind that this is not a 100% robust way to do this. If we had more time available, if I wanted to focus on it, we'd use some worksheet events perhaps, or maybe even some fancy ActiveX controls or form controls to create drop-down lists and input boxes. But for the time being, I think I'm kind of happy with that system as it is. The most important part of all this is creating the update system. So what I'd like to be able to do is have a button that I can click on somewhere here that will feed in the values that I've selected from cell B1 and B2 to generate the query string of the URL. So let's head back to the VBA editor, and I'm just going to maximize the window at this point. And at this stage, I'm just going to make another copy of my import xrates routine. So if I copy all of that and paste it in just below, I'm then going to change the name of the subroutine, so it's called update xrates, and then let's have a quick look at how we can modify our URL first of all. It'll help us a little bit to have a unique name for our worksheet. So the worksheet we've created with our little system on it is currently called sheet 7, so it's got both a code name and a sheet name. If I select that object in the Object Explorer and then head to the name property at the bottom, I'm going to call this one WS rates. Then I'm going to move this little line here, set ws equals worksheets.add. I don't really need that anymore. I certainly don't need to add a new worksheet. All I need to do in order to reference the data table that I'm on is refer to it as ws rates. So let's just remove that for the time being. What I'm then going to do is start modifying my query string. So I've got everything up to the from parameter, from equals. I'm going to type in a closed double quote at that point, and then after that, I'm going to type in an ampersand and replace the USD with a reference to range B1 on my WS rates worksheet. So if I remove the USD and then instead say WS rates dot range B1 dot value. So that refers to and reads out the value of range B1 on the WS rate sheet. Of course it does. At that point, what I need to do is have another ampersand to concatenate the next part of the query string, and the next part of the query string was ampersand amount equals. So I've just opened up some more double quotes here, and then I've got ampersand amount equals. After the equals, I need to close the double quotes. In fact, I can get away with just deleting the number 1 there, because what I need to do then is concatenate the value of range B2. So if I add an ampersand at the end, and I can simply then copy and paste what I typed in earlier, WS rates range B1.value, and update that to range B2.value. Let me just change the way this looks just so you can read it all on one single screen with. I'll break it down across multiple different lines using the continuation characters, so a bunch of space and underscores, and hopefully that makes it a little bit easier to read. Okay, so just a few more changes still to make. I don't need to add a new query table to my query tables collection. Oh, and I also need to change the worksheet that I'm referencing here as well. So I've removed my WS variable. Oh, beg pardon, I haven't removed it at all. So let's just delete that one as well. But I don't need to refer to WS anymore. I'm not generating a new worksheet. I've got a specific named sheet called WS rates. So let's change that to set qt equals WS rates, query tables, and then rather than adding a new one, what I'm going to do is replace all of that with a reference to the first query table on that worksheet. Now, it's all query tables are indexed. I've got a number indicating their position, so I could just say query tables 1. I know that I've only got one query table, but as I've given my query table a sensible name from earlier on, it might make a little bit more sense to use that name instead. So rather than saying 1, let's use xrates just to make the code a little bit more readable. So let me just get rid of a few blank lines. Not much more to do at this point. I can get rid of basically all of these properties that I modified earlier on. I don't need to change any of those at this stage. So let's get rid of all the extra properties apart from the refresh method. We'll leave that in there. The only property that I do need to change is the connection property. Now this is ordinarily what you set when you add a new query table, but it's a property that can be modified afterwards as well. So I'm going to set connection to be equal to And if you remember that all URLs need to, or all URL connections for query tables need to begin with URL semicolon, close double quotes, and then concatenate to that the URL that we've just constructed. So at that point we've got all the code pretty much written. So let's head back into the Excel workbook and create a nice, useful, sensible way for the user to run this code. So let's head back to the Developer tab in the ribbon and find the Insert tool about halfway along. I'm going to use a basic form controls button for this. So in the top left hand corner of the Insert toolbox I can click on the button, then either click and drag or click once on the background of the worksheet. I'm going to choose to assign my Update X Rates subroutine to that and then click OK. Change the button's name, so whatever it happens to be, let's call it Update instead, and then click away from the button just to activate it. Should you need to make any further changes, the simplest way to do that is to right click on the button to select it, and then you can just edit the text again. So rather than clicking on it with the left mouse button, because what that will do, hopefully, fingers crossed, is run our code. So we're currently looking at $1. I've set it to GBP 0.5, so if I click update, what should happen is the query table will refresh to use GBP. So let's give that a couple more tests. Let's try euros, and let's say, I know, 1.99, and then click update again. And again, after a short pause, the query table will update. So there's a nice kind of basic interactive little system for the end user to update your query tables. Now, I have talked a little bit about using basic data validation techniques to control what the user enters here. Do bear in mind, as I mentioned before, that data validation is not necessarily the most robust way to do this. So although I've got a drop-down list of values, I could happily clear the contents of that drop-down list just by hitting delete, and then if I tried to update it, it would pass a null to the query string, which would cause us, essentially, well, it would cause the connection not to update. If I click the update button, in fact, you'll see it's trying to run the background query down at the bottom, but it's never going to come up with a solution, so I'm just going to click here to cancel and then choose to stop the refresh, and then I can close down the dialog box. So if I wanted to prevent that from happening, I could write some code to check that that cell B1 was populated, and likewise we saw that we could easily override the basic data validation. If I do type in text, the validation should be triggered and tell me that. I can't do that, but if I copied and pasted over the top of that cell, then the validation will be broken. So we could write a bit of code to just handle those two things, just to wrap up this video, make it a little bit more robust. So let's head back to the VB editor and we'll add a tiny little bit more code to the top of our Update X Rates routine. And the first fairly easy thing to do is test whether cell B1 contains a value. So we've done this in several videos previously. What all I'm going to do here, below my variable declarations, is I'm going to say if WSRates.range B1 .value equals an empty string. Then, depending on whether I'd like to display an error message or not, I could just simply say here exit sub in a single inline if, like so. Then, if I did want to display an error message, then I would have to have some kind of block if and have a separate message box statement. So let's have a message box that says you must choose a currency, for instance. Beg your pardon, you must choose a currency. And then you could have, I guess, a VB warning symbol on there. Sorry, VB exclamation, I'm sorry. There we go. Then we'll exit the sub and we can say end if. Testing if we've entered a value in cell B2 is fairly similar. We could also test if the value in cell B2 is a number or not using the isNumeric function. So in fact, if we just go straight away with saying if not isNumeric, then open some parentheses and refer to range B2 value. I'll just do a quick cheat, copy and paste WSRates range B1.value, and then, sorry, I forgot to copy it. Let's do that again. And then I'll change the cell reference to cell B2 instead. So if not is numeric, then you can have maybe a message box saying the amount must be a number. And then we could also have a VB exclamation. Importantly, we should exit the sub so that the rest of the procedure doesn't continue, and we could then put in an end if. If we'd established that it was a number that we'd entered into the cell, we could add an else clause, I guess, here. So we could say else, so if it was a number, we could check if that number was within a certain range. So we could do that within an else block of this main block if, or we could also just wait until we'd reached and do this in a separate if statement. So we can only reach this next if statement. We can only get past this end if the value in that cell is a number. So we could just do this in a completely separate if statement. So let's say if ws_rates.rangeB2.value, and we want to say something like if it was less than 0.1, or ws_rates.rangeB2.value was greater than 100, then message box, or you could enter a message specifically telling the user what range is valid. Let's just say that amount is too low or high, to avoid having to write out a really long, complicated message. I suspect you're getting bored of just watching me fumble around trying to type properly at this point. So exit sub and then end if. So that's a few basic techniques you could use just to make sure that the user's typed in sensible values. Let's give that one all a quick test, like by heading back to the workbook, and let's try filling in or making a few mistakes to make sure the validation works. First thing I guess we should do is clear the contents of cell B1. So let's select that and hit the delete key on the keyboard and click update, and we must choose a currency. Oh yeah, of course we must. So let's do that. Let's go for let's go for euros instead. Let's then try, if I type in a bit of text in a cell somewhere and copy and paste that over the top of cell B2 just to break the validation, what I can then do is check if I click the update button. Oh, the amount must be a number. Oh yeah, duh, of course it must. So let's try typing in a negative number and then click update. It's a number, but it's too low or too high. Let's try typing in a higher number. Let's go for a positive number. Oh, that's too high as well. So let's pick somewhere in the middle. Let's say 50 and then click update. And finally, what I should see is that having established I've validated all my rules or passed all my validation checks, I get a sensible update. Phew, so there we go. I'm sure you can expand upon that idea and come up with some much fancier things than I've done in this video, but those are the basic core principles behind creating query tables connected to web pages. Hope you found that one useful and enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, see you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseOwl website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.